Can you really save the world without losing yourself in the process? Victor thought he had the answer. He was a man with a mission, a man determined to heal the world, to fix what was broken. But as the weight of his responsibilities grew, so did the question that haunted him. How much of himself could he sacrifice for this goal? Victor had always believed that saving others meant something greater than saving himself. He was willing to push aside his own needs, his own emotions, in pursuit of the greater good. But every decision, every step forward, took a little more from him. It wasn't just about the world anymore. It was about him losing sight of who he truly was. This is the trauma Victor carries, his deep-rooted need to prove himself. Raised in a world where connection was a luxury, Victor learned early on that his worth was tied to what he could give, not who he was. As he ventured further into his mission, he started losing pieces of himself. Each sacrifice, each painful choice, left him emptier. Victor's defense mechanism is denial. He tells himself it's worth it, that the world's healing justifies his loss. He pushes away the nagging doubts that grow louder in his mind, refusing to acknowledge how much he is changing. It's easier to deny the pain than face it. He tells himself he's doing this for others. But deep inside, Victor knows it's a lie. The more he saves, the more he loses. The inner conflict builds, slowly but surely. On one hand, he wants to believe that his actions are for a noble cause. But on the other, he's terrified of what he's becoming. Is this the price of greatness? He is now faced with a reality that he never anticipated. Saving others might mean destroying himself. The trigger for his breakdown comes when he reaches the tipping point. A moment of failure, a situation where his efforts seem meaningless, shakes his resolve. Victor is forced to confront the truth he's been avoiding. The more he gives, the more he loses. And what's left of him is a shell of the man he once was. This breakdown leads to the consequences Victor never thought possible. He's left standing, a man who has lost his humanity in the name of saving the world. The people he sought to help don't see him as a savior anymore. They see someone who has sacrificed too much, someone who is no longer whole. As he stares at the pieces of himself scattered in the wake of his decisions, Victor realizes the true cost of healing the world. The emotional bridge between him and the people he tried to save begins to dissolve, and for the first time, Victor wonders if it was all worth it. If you had to choose between saving others and saving yourself, could you live with the cost? Victor had always been the kind of person who felt compelled to fix what was broken. It was a deep-seated belief that everything could be healed, if only enough effort was put in. But somewhere along the way, this belief began to consume him, and he started to ignore the one thing that mattered most, his own well-being. Victor's need to fix the world stemmed from a sense of inadequacy that had plagued him for years. As a child, he had learned to rely on himself, to become self-sufficient because he never felt supported by others. His childhood was a quiet struggle, one where love and attention were scarce, and every achievement had to be earned through relentless effort. This pattern continued into adulthood, where Victor began to believe that his value was tied to what he could do for others, not who he was as a person. The trauma from his past left him with a constant feeling of not being enough. It was this belief that drove his obsession with healing the world. In his mind, if he could fix the suffering of others, maybe, just maybe, he would be able to heal the void within himself. Victor's defense mechanism was to bury his own feelings and focus entirely on others. He had become so consumed by his mission that he refused to acknowledge the emotional toll it was taking on him. He pushed his own needs to the back burner, telling himself that his sacrifices were necessary for the greater good. It wasn't just about healing others anymore. It was about proving his worth. The deeper Victor got into his mission, the more he found himself spiraling into emotional numbness. He told himself that he was doing the right thing, that he could handle it, that the pain was temporary. But the truth was, Victor was slowly losing touch with his emotions. He was no longer able to connect with the people he was trying to help. His once strong sense of empathy began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of isolation. Victor's inner conflict grew as he struggled to reconcile his desire to help others with the reality of what it was costing him. There was a part of him that knew the price he was paying was too high, but he couldn't stop. He was driven by a deep fear of failure, a fear of being useless. If he stopped, if he allowed himself to feel anything, he feared he would crumble. But as time went on, Victor began to notice the cracks in his own psyche. The weight of his mission had become too much to bear. The realization hit him like a wave. He was no longer the man he used to be. Victor had become a shell of himself, his soul slowly eroding with every step he took toward his goal. The consequences of his actions were now impossible to ignore. He had become disconnected from his own emotions, from the very essence of who he was. He had sacrificed his humanity in the name of healing the world, and in doing so, he had lost everything he had once held dear. Victor looked at himself in the mirror, and for the first time in years, he didn't recognize the person staring back at him. He had become a stranger to himself, a person consumed by the very thing he had tried to fix. The emotional bridge that once connected him to others had disintegrated, leaving him isolated in a world he had tried so hard to save. Victor's journey was a cautionary tale, one that raised the question of whether it's truly possible to help others without losing yourself in the process. Was the sacrifice worth it? And at what point does healing the world become a hollow victory? Victor's internal conflict deepened as he faced the growing realization that his mission to heal the world had come at an unbearable cost. Despite his outward confidence and determination, there was a constant tug inside him, a feeling of emptiness that no amount of success could fill. His childhood had been one of isolation, where love and affection were scarce commodities. He learned early on that his value came from what he could do, not from who he was. As an adult, this belief became the driving force behind everything he did. He convinced himself that if he could just help enough people, he would finally feel whole, finally earn the love and approval he had never received. Yet, as Victor poured more of himself into his work, the more he realized that what he truly craved was not the validation of others, but the simple feeling of being loved and seen for who he truly was. This unmet need gnawed at him constantly. No matter how much he gave, there was always a sense of being unseen, unnoticed, and unappreciated. It was as if his efforts were an endless cycle of giving without ever receiving. The deeper Victor delved into his mission, the more he began to push aside his own feelings. He used work as a shield, an excuse to avoid confronting his unmet emotional needs. He told himself that once the world was healed, he would finally find peace, that the love he so desperately sought would come from his accomplishments. But this logic was flawed. Victor had been so focused on fixing the external world that he ignored the internal one, the world inside himself that needed healing just as much as those he sought to help. His defense mechanism was to bury his emotions, to reject the idea that his pain could be valid. After all, what right did he have to complain when he was saving others? He denied his own need for love, telling himself it was selfish to want anything in return for all the good he was doing. Yet, this denial only served to deepen his internal conflict. As Victor's mission progressed, the weight of his unaddressed needs became impossible to ignore. His sense of self-worth, which had always been tied to his ability to heal others, was eroding. He began to question whether all the lives he touched were worth the cost of his own humanity. Each time he helped someone, it felt like he was losing a piece of himself. His isolation grew. Despite his outward success, Victor felt more alone than ever before. His unmet need for connection and love created a barrier between him and the people he was trying to help. They saw him as a savior, but he saw himself as someone who had lost everything in the process. Victor's internal conflict reached a breaking point when he realized that he could no longer ignore the reality of what he had become. The pursuit of healing the world had transformed him into a person he no longer recognized. He had sacrificed his own humanity for the sake of others, and in doing so, he had lost the very thing he had been trying to save, his sense of self. The emotional void he had sought to fill with his work remained, as hollow and unyielding as ever. Now, Victor faced the harsh truth. Healing the world could never fix the wounds inside him. The internal conflict, the unmet need for love, and the cost of his sacrifices were now undeniable. The path he had chosen had not led to redemption, but to a soul exhausted by the weight of its own unfulfilled desires. Victor had always prided himself on being in control, but one day, everything shifted. It wasn't a grand event, no dramatic confrontation, but a subtle shift, a small moment that triggered his psychological breakdown. Victor was in the middle of his routine, a quiet morning spent reviewing progress reports, when he received an unexpected message, a letter from someone he had tried to help years ago. The letter was a thank you note, one that spoke of the profound changes in their life, of healing and growth, all thanks to Victor's efforts. At first, Victor was pleased. He had made a difference. But then, a nagging feeling began to creep in. The gratitude in the letter, although genuine, felt hollow. The person was thanking him for their success, their recovery, but Victor realized that he had never received that kind of acknowledgement for himself. He had given so much of himself to others, yet no one had ever truly seen him. The trigger was simple, but it hit Victor hard. It was the realization that, despite all of his efforts, he had never truly been appreciated for who he was. The people he helped had moved on with their lives, and he was left behind, standing in the shadow of his own sacrifices. This moment marked the beginning of Victor's unraveling. He had always pushed his personal needs aside, telling himself that his worth was found in the lives he changed. But now, the weight of that belief became unbearable. The disconnect between his internal desires and the external validation he sought was too vast to ignore. Victor's trigger had exposed a truth he had been avoiding. His mission, his need to heal the world, was rooted in a desperate need for approval that could never truly be satisfied. This realization forced Victor to confront the pain he had buried for so long. His desire to fix the world had always been about filling the void within himself, but now he saw that the void was not something that could be fixed by helping others. He had lost sight of his own humanity in the process. As Victor sat there, reading the letter over and over again, the weight of his actions hit him with full force. He had given everything, and in return, he had nothing. His quest to heal the world had drained him of the very essence he had hoped to preserve. The trigger wasn't just the letter. It was the moment Victor finally realized he had sacrificed his own identity for the approval of others. This realization sent him spiraling. He could no longer deny that he was not the man he once was. The self he had known had been consumed by the mission, and what remained was an empty shell of someone desperate for validation. His quest had become a prison, one where he was trapped by his own need for recognition. Victor now faced the painful truth that, in trying to save the world, he had lost himself in the process. Victor sat in the dim light of his office, staring at the walls that had witnessed years of his work. The world outside seemed distant, irrelevant now, as the weight of his choices crushed him from within. The journey that had once been driven by a deep desire to heal had become a suffocating cycle. Every step he had taken toward healing others had slowly drained him of everything he once held dear. What had started as a noble cause had turned into an all-consuming force, one that stripped him of his humanity. The moment he received the letter had been the tipping point. It wasn't just a thank you note. It was the final reminder of his emptiness. He had given everything, his time, his energy, his soul, and yet, he was still left alone. His work had created a world where others thrived, but it had also created a void within himself that no amount of success could fill. The psychological breakdown that followed was not sudden, but it was profound. It began as a quiet realization that he had been living a lie. Victor had convinced himself that helping others would bring him peace, that he would find purpose through the lives he changed. But the truth was, his quest for validation had overshadowed everything else. He had become obsessed with the idea of being needed, of proving his worth through his sacrifices. The self-deception was no longer sustainable. Victor had pushed his own emotional needs to the back of his mind for so long that they could no longer be ignored. The yearning for connection, for love, for validation, these needs were no longer whispers in his mind. They were a constant, painful ache that gnawed at him. The more he gave, the emptier he felt. Each act of kindness, each effort to heal, had only highlighted his own inadequacy. As the realization settled in, Victor's sense of self began to unravel. He had sacrificed too much of himself to the cause. The more he sought to save others, the further he drifted from the person he used to be. The walls that had once symbolized his strength now felt like the walls of a prison. The truth was undeniable. Victor had lost his sense of identity. The man he had become was a stranger, someone who existed only to fulfill the expectations of others. His emotional state had become fragile, and the foundations of his psyche had begun to crack under the pressure. Victor could no longer ignore the toll it had taken on him. The emptiness he felt was not something that could be filled by his work or the gratitude of others. He had been so focused on fixing the world that he had neglected the one thing that needed healing the most, himself. This awareness of his own deterioration was both liberating and devastating. Victor realized that the path he had chosen, the mission he had pursued with such fervor, had led him to a place of profound loss. The man who had once been driven by the desire to help others now found himself struggling to simply survive. His internal collapse was not marked by an obvious crisis, but by the slow, agonizing realization that he had given up everything for something that would never fulfill him. He was no longer sure who he was, or what he was even trying to achieve. All that remained was a shell of the person he used to be, adrift in a world that he had tried so hard to change. The transformation was complete. Victor was no longer the man who had set out to heal the world. He was a man broken by his own efforts. The long-term psychological consequences of Victor's choices became more apparent as the days went by. The man he had once been, filled with purpose and driven by a desire to help others, had gradually faded into a shadow of himself. His sense of self-worth, once tied to his ability to heal the world, had eroded, leaving a deep sense of inadequacy and isolation. The impact of his sacrifices had not only worn him down physically, but it had also left lasting scars on his mental state. Victor's obsession with fixing the world had blinded him to the fact that he was neglecting the very thing that needed healing the most, himself. His emotional void, which he had attempted to fill with external accomplishments, only grew deeper with time. What he had failed to realize was that the more he gave, the more he lost. The psychological toll of his choices was cumulative, with each sacrifice, each act of selflessness, pushing him further away from the person he used to be. Victor's inability to reconcile his inner conflict had lasting effects on his mental well-being. The constant push and pull between his need for validation and his fear of failure created an emotional turbulence that he could no longer ignore. The longer he ignored his own needs, the more they festered beneath the surface, gradually consuming him from the inside out. As Victor's internal collapse deepened, he found himself questioning his ability to connect with others. The relationships he had once cherished had become distant and strained. People saw him as a savior, but Victor felt like a fraud, incapable of experiencing the genuine connections he so desperately craved. His inability to accept his own vulnerability had caused a rift between him and those around him. The consequences of Victor's emotional repression were not just internal. They manifested in his interactions with others as well. He had built a life centered on external validation, but the absence of authentic connections left him feeling hollow and detached. As the years passed, the weight of his choices grew heavier. Victor had spent so much of his life focused on fixing others that he had lost touch with his own humanity. The psychological consequences of this neglect were profound, leading to feelings of worthlessness, isolation, and self-doubt. The longer Victor lived in this state of emotional turmoil, the more difficult it became for him to break free. He was trapped in a cycle of self-sacrifice, unable to escape the patterns of behavior that had defined his existence for so long. The consequences of Victor's actions would follow him for the rest of his life. The emotional scars he had accumulated would never fully heal. As he looked back on his journey, Victor could see the path he had taken, a path that had led him further away from his true self. The toll it had taken on his mind and soul was undeniable. The cost of healing the world had been too great. He had lost himself in the process, and the long-term psychological consequences of that loss would be felt for years to come. Victor had spent so many years dedicating himself to others that he never stopped to consider how isolated he had become. It was a subtle feeling at first, something that crept into his life slowly, until one day it consumed him completely. He had been so focused on healing the world that he had neglected the one person who mattered most, himself. This neglect led to a profound sense of abandonment, a feeling that no matter how much he gave, he was never truly seen or understood. He had always told himself that helping others would bring him fulfillment, but now, in the silence of his own mind, he realized the painful truth. His actions were a desperate attempt to fill a void that could never be filled by external validation. Victor had spent so much of his life convincing himself that his worth was measured by his ability to save others. He was driven by the belief that, If he just helped enough people, he would finally feel like he mattered. But now, all he felt was loneliness, a deep, aching loneliness that no one could see, no one could understand. He had pushed away the people who cared about him, distancing himself from them in the name of his mission. The more he tried to fix the world, the more disconnected he became from the world around him. Victor's loneliness wasn't just about physical isolation. It was the feeling of being misunderstood, of having no one to truly confide in. He had become so wrapped up in his own quest for validation that he couldn't see how much he had pushed people away. He couldn't recognize how much he had isolated himself from love and connection. The emotional toll was unbearable, and as the years went on, it only grew stronger. Victor had reached a point where he no longer knew how to be close to anyone. He had built walls around himself, walls made of past disappointments, rejections, and sacrifices. These walls kept the world at a distance, but they also kept him from the very thing he needed most, human connection. The more Victor realized this, the more it hurt. He saw others around him living their lives, forming relationships, finding happiness, while he remained in his self-imposed prison. The loneliness wasn't just about being physically alone. It was about feeling emotionally disconnected from everyone, including himself. He had become someone who had given everything to others, yet had nothing left for himself. This deep sense of being misunderstood haunted him, as he couldn't find anyone who could truly understand the pain he was carrying. He had sacrificed so much for a cause that never truly brought him the peace he had hoped for. He had hoped that healing the world would somehow heal his own wounds, but instead, it had left him broken. Victor's feelings of abandonment and loneliness were a result of his inability to acknowledge his own needs. He had spent so much time focusing on the needs of others that he had neglected to care for himself. Now, he found himself at a crossroads, struggling to understand how he had ended up here, in this place of isolation. His mind raced with questions, but the answers were elusive. He had given everything, yet he was left with nothing but the haunting feeling of being lost and unseen. Victor felt a sense of growing despair as he walked through the empty halls of his life. It wasn't the physical emptiness that weighed on him. It was the overwhelming emotional void that seemed to consume him at every turn. For years, he had been the one to offer help, to give everything. He had to those in need. But in the end, he was left with nothing. No one had seen the sacrifices he had made. No one had recognized the depth of the pain he carried. He was surrounded by people who appreciated what he had done, but they didn't see the man behind the mission. They didn't see the loneliness, the internal struggle that had defined his life. Victor felt abandoned, not by others, but by himself. His sense of identity had been lost in the constant drive to save the world. He had given so much of himself to others that there was little left for him to give. And now, as he stood alone, he couldn't help but wonder if all his efforts had been in vain. The feeling of abandonment was suffocating. It wasn't just about the lack of companionship, it was the feeling that, after everything, he had no one who truly understood him. The people he had helped were moving on with their lives, and Victor was left behind, still trapped in the web of his own making. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't seem to break free. He had sacrificed his emotional needs, his desires, for the sake of others, and in doing so, he had disconnected from his own humanity. The loneliness was overwhelming. Victor realized that no matter how much he helped others, no matter how many lives he touched, he could never fill the emptiness inside him. He had been so focused on fixing the world that he had neglected to fix himself. Now, in the quiet of his thoughts, he could hear the echoes of his own unmet needs. The realization hit him hard. He had spent so much time trying to be the person everyone else needed him to be that he had lost sight of the person he truly was. He had become someone he didn't recognize, someone who had given everything but had nothing left to offer. Victor's feelings of being misunderstood were impossible to ignore. He had dedicated his life to helping others, but in the process, he had lost the one thing that mattered most, himself. The emotional void inside him seemed to grow with each passing day. He had been so caught up in the mission, so absorbed in the pursuit of approval, that he had forgotten what it meant to truly connect with others. The more he gave, the more disconnected he became. His relationships had become superficial, built on the foundation of his work rather than genuine connection. He had isolated himself, unknowingly, in the name of a cause that had cost him everything. The loneliness was no longer just a feeling, It had become his reality. Victor had built walls around himself, walls that kept others out and, more importantly, kept him from himself. He had spent so much time trying to save others that he had forgotten how to save himself. Now, as he faced the consequences of his choices, he was left to confront the painful truth. He had lost the very thing he had been trying to protect, his own sense of self. Victor had always believed that he could save the world, but the deeper he delved into his mission, the more he realized how deeply he had lost touch with himself. He had spent so much time trying to fix others, to heal their wounds, that he had neglected to acknowledge the wounds within himself. The pain of abandonment was a constant, gnawing presence. He had given so much of himself to the world, but in doing so, he had pushed away those who could have offered him the support and love he so desperately needed. The loneliness he now felt was a direct consequence of his inability to nurture his own emotional well-being. The more Victor focused on the needs of others, the further he drifted from his own humanity. His deep-seated fear of being misunderstood haunted him. He had always felt that, no matter how much he gave, no one truly saw him for who he was. His mission had become an escape, a way to avoid facing the painful truth that he had never truly been understood, even by those closest to him. He had built walls around himself, not out of malice, but out of a desperate desire to protect his fragile sense of self. As the years passed, these walls grew higher, and Victor found himself trapped behind them. The more he helped, the more distant he became from the world he was trying to save. Victor's sense of abandonment was not just about being alone physically. It was the emotional isolation that had become his reality. He had convinced himself that his worth was tied to his ability to heal others, but the more he focused on others, the more disconnected he became from his own needs. The people he had helped had moved on with their lives, while he remained, stuck in a perpetual cycle of self-sacrifice. The loneliness Victor felt was not just a passing feeling. It was a profound emptiness that grew with every passing day. He had spent his life seeking validation from external sources, but now, standing in the silence of his own thoughts, he realized how little he had truly given to himself. His emotional needs had gone unmet for so long that they had become an afterthought, a secondary priority to the mission he had devoted his life to. Victor now understood that, in trying to save others, he had lost himself. He had given away parts of himself that he could never get back, and in doing so, he had sacrificed his own sense of identity. The realization was crushing. Victor had hoped that helping others would bring him the fulfillment he sought, but instead, it had left him with a deep sense of loss. The very thing he had sought to fix, the world, had become a reflection of his own fractured sense of self. The more he tried to heal others, the more broken he became. This cycle of giving without receiving had left Victor emotionally drained, disconnected from the people around him, and, most painfully, disconnected from himself. The loneliness he felt was no longer just a feeling, it was his reality. He had spent so many years believing that saving the world would fill the void inside him. But now, he saw the painful truth, that the world could not heal him if he could not heal himself first.